to know before I begin the service that I am now without a father. And my father died early Monday morning. And it's strange to give your first Sunday service without your father. Yet at the same time, he's never been more with me. And I can't explain that. If I happen to touch your tears in gratitude for your father by daring to cry in front of you, let you also go through it. And please don't misinterpret this as sadness. It's really very special. And those of you who knew my father, do you mind? Please talk to me or something. Does anybody have fresh Kleenex? See? I'll use old Kleenex. Oh, how sweet. Oh, nice. Hugs so fill you up. And of course, my supreme destiny had to have me giving a lesson on communion this morning, on communication, on loving, just so that we could imprint it even deeper in the heart of poor Carol. I flew home and did the funeral services Thursday afternoon. It was wonderful. And my mother is fine. My mother finally has some time after 4 years of total care. So, and thank you all for crying with me. Now, want to just sit here and kind of do it together. Since my lesson is on communion, the communion of communication, as I was flying home on the plane, I thought, I need to show them the only way I truly know how to commune, which is with a piano. And I'm going to play the piano for you two ways. I'm going to break into the middle of a Chopin scherzo and play for you one of the tenderest melodies there is. And the first way I'm going to play it is without communion. And the second way I'll play it is with communion. My assumption is it will tell everything. do is take a look at the distinction. You'd all put your Kleenexes away and cut it out. Let's get on. When I first started playing a piano, back when I was 9 years old, my teacher used to sit with me, my first teacher, and she would say, "Carol, put some expression in it." And being 9 years old, I didn't know what expression was, so she coached me. And she'd say, "Well, you know, sometimes you use rubato and you push ahead and then you hold back." And then she said, "Sometimes you talk to the keys." She used to say, "Talk to the keys." She'd say, "Sometimes you're soft and sometimes you're loud, and sometimes you go at different paces." Gradually I began to get the feeling of it, and I learned how to put expression into it. Communication is about putting expression into life. And when I talk like this, I'd like you to realize that I'm not only talking about communicating with the mates we live with, or the children we live with, or the families that we live with. I'm talking about communicating with creatures, flowers, life itself. Communication isn't only with people, it's with the whole universe that you're living with. Then I went on to my master teacher, and my master teacher did some marvelous things. One of his phrases was, he used to say, "I want you to caress the keys." And another word that he gave to me that was absolutely exquisite was, he said, "I would like you to make the key become an extension of your finger." When we aren't communicating with something, all we do is play it. Like playing the piano. Now I'd like you to see me caress a key and let a key become an extension of myself. See how my body changes in form even? Caress. It's like making love too. See the difference? Is it obvious to you? When I look at the way we play life and the way we play each other, I realize that there are certain attitudes that keep us from communicating, from building relationships that have power. And one of the obvious areas where we seem to be getting our lifestyles mixed up maybe is that our life seems to be going at tremendous speed. We're caught up very much in production, and we seem to be caught up in computerese. Can you imagine what's happening to our society when we let our communication be taken over by computers? We are in the midst of a communication explosion. If you read Megatrends, it tells you all about it. But the sad thing is that the communication explosion is being taken care of through computers evermore. And with that kind of thinking, and I am not condemning, I think you know me well enough to know I'm not condemning, but with that kind of thinking, what happens is that we begin to rely more and more and more upon more and more artificial means in order to take care of the business of life. We wake up one day and we say, "I never saw my child grow up. I don't remember experiencing what was going on inside of their souls. I don't remember having really hugged them." In the speed of our life, what we discover is that we let things go by very quickly. Instead of sharing embraces or hugs or communion, what we end up sharing is a quick look as we pass in the hall with our coffee cup in our hand. What we share is a quick cup to say "I love you" instead of a deep embracing hug. That speed that occurs within our system is dangerous, I think, and it makes a very fragile alliance amongst us all, because we don't take the time to make the meetings occur within our lives. So we have no time for communion. We don't make contact through to a person. We let them pass by very quickly. When we look at somebody, rather than really looking at them and taking them in and reaching out to them as I'm doing to you, we hardly even get our eyes off of the mouth or off of the shoulder and into the eyes to make the contact. With this speed and awareness of productivity and computerese, rather than caressing life, we play life. And we let our sexuality become probably the only place where we're willing to make true contacts. But you know, more and more I read about what's going on with us sexually, I find that we've even got our whole head aimed toward orgasm and climax, and we've let go of the loving that occurs in the preparation for the sexual experience. When I think about my mother and how she's caressing life, she said some special things to me while I was there. She said the urn was brought by yesterday, and the urn with the ashes of my father in it, and she said I placed it out in the kitchen, and she said every time I go by, I pick it up and I hug him. And I didn't feel there was the slightest bit of maudlin in that there was a real sense of her appreciating him. And this may be too exposed to say to you, but I'm going to say it to you anyway. I know that because of my father's illness that they hadn't been able to have a true sexual sharing for a long time. But oh, I know that they caressed each other and that they touched each other all the way through. And that stroking became a part of their life. You know, we get all caught up with impotency in our society. There was even a 2020 program done on it last Thursday evening. Did you see it? And we get all concerned about the climax of the thing. You see, that's the production, that's the speed. And we don't appreciate the process of experiencing, of just touching another person, of putting our cheek up against them in a close hug. All those parts of caressing rather than just playing life. And you know, a lot of us, in the speed of our life and our inability to communicate and to caress life, we take care of it in funny ways, and I'd suggest that you take a look at it. The way we take care of it is by being flippant with each other. Is that the way you are? Or we'll joke instead of coming in close to each other. We'll cut a person off or pass them by. We'll end up with callous comments, almost as if our relationships become callous comments to each other. You know why? Because we are afraid of making that communion, of making that connection, of coming in very close and getting the meat of life. The meat of life to me is how many people I've been able to touch on the shoulder. The meat of my trip home was daring to go up to a young child sitting in a mother's arms who was crying at the airport and patting the child on the head even though the child was a stranger, and not letting my fear that the mother would think I was strange keep me from touching the child on the head. You know about those things, don't you? I'm not afraid to reach out to a stranger. Finally, in the spiritual life, how can a stranger be any different from my mother or my father? That's what we're trying to learn. It's another thing that goes with this, that in our computerized language, I have noticed that we've become a society that doesn't write notes to each other, that doesn't say thank you to each other. One of the last things my mother said to me was, do you think it's all right if I send thank you notes next week? Of course, I encouraged her that it was perfectly fine. What touched me was that she mentioned sending thank you notes. I don't want to lay guilt trips on you this morning, yet maybe I do. When was the last time that you sent a thank you note to somebody to tell them that you appreciate them? How many of you, quite naturally now in today's mail, tear up immediately any piece of mail that looks like it's impersonal and look for the personal note? Is there anybody else besides me who looks including Community Center of Yesterday we had the wonderful experience of having 51 people become new trainees for the lay ministry program, and they are an exciting lot of people. My God, they're going to turn this place into a flaming fire. And there are an awful lot of those people who are in computer work. And in their computer work, they're looking at the lay ministry. You know why? I'm sure because they want to touch. What does it say in Megatrends? That we must be a society of high tech and high touch. It must go hand in hand. And I'm not suggesting that you all go out and start touching everybody. I think that would be very dangerous. I am suggesting that we be reminded of it and that we wake up to it and that we come into contact with it. One of the women in the lay ministry program yesterday talked about the fact that she was a part of a program that brought puppies into convalescent homes. And that by bringing those puppies into the convalescent homes, that people there began to make contact with their feelings and their love portions again and again and again. The last thing that I did with my mother was to look at her just before I left and feel what her life has now become, 81 years old, totally alone in a home. And as I picked her up and held her in my arms, I found myself crying into her. And as I cried into her, as I let myself penetrate through her into her life, the bond was deepened. Sharing a puppy is deepening a bond. Remembering that part of our life, sending a note is deepening a bond. And then I think about my father, and you may get very tired of all this, but naturally I'm going to use every bit of my experience to share with you this morning. I think about my father who at the age of 58 got kicked out of a job he'd been in for 38 years. And he got kicked out because, you see, he'd gotten too old and they didn't need him anymore as high tech moved on. And I watched him. I was a junior in college at the time, and I watched him go through his turmoil. And he went from being a white-collar man to being a blue-collar man, and became a part of survival through labor. And his labor was through doing landscaping work around town. And I can remember him as he worked through his pain, that what he did was to go out into the backyard and there put his hands in the earth and communicate with a rose. And the rose, you see, helped bring him back to life. And it's because of that that he ended up beginning a whole new business at the age of 60 years old that now carries his name 23 years later. There's something to the importance of communion, penetrating all the way through. Now, I had a relatively miraculous experience for this lesson because I had forgotten what the title of it was, and the onrush of losing my father. And when I went home, I didn't have any remembrance of it. And coming back in the plane, I decided I ought to start pulling in my ideas on it. And I sat down and I wrote, okay, so you can talk about all this powerful stuff about communion and communication. I said, but what does it involve? What's required? And I wrote down 4 simple ideas that I thought required were a part of communication. And when I looked at it, I thought, how does this fit into Jesus' life? And I thought, my God, it's the Last Supper. And then when I got home, and this morning I got up to go look at what my true title was supposed to be, lo and behold, if I wasn't not talking this morning about communication, but my title was communion. Can you capture that integration of how synchronetic it truly is, how marvelous that it truly is? So with that, in order to take you into the ideas of how we might commune, it's easy for anybody to stand up and say, we're not doing this and we're not doing that, and too bad we don't do this. But then how do we carry that through and make it an integrated part of our lives? I'd like to read to you the Last Supper experience with Jesus. And as I do, I'd like you to think about yourself. I'd like to think about maybe the people, the personalities, the little creatures in your life, maybe the fish that you haven't fed for a week. Or the roses you haven't yet given their spring feeding, and it's about upon us, And I'd like to have you think about that and realize that the Last Supper is a symbolic event. I don't know if Jesus ever thought Carol Watts on February 3rd, 1985 would use it to communicate communion with others. But I'd like you to use it as a symbolic event to see whether maybe there is within you the capacity to bring this kind of quality more deeply into your life. I have not dealt at all this morning with those of you who hate the people you're living with. I haven't dealt at all this morning with the breaches that happen between people, and I don't have time to. I'll let you work that one out. But I'm now going to give you like a golden gift of the principles of communion that we might carry into our everyday life. The way the scene opens is really fascinating. Jesus knows that he's going to be cast into his own death. He knows that he's going to be turned in. He knows it will be one of his disciples, and he knows who it is. Yet, on that evening, Even though all the events are against him, what does he do? He sets up a magnificent feast. And this is how he does it. It says in Matthew 26, verse 20, when it was evening, he sat at table with the 12 disciples. And as they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to talk to him, and then one to another. And they said, "Is it I, Lord?" And he answered them. And then Judas, who betrayed him, said, "But is it I, Master?" And Jesus said to him, "You have said so." Now as they were eating, Jesus broke bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to each of the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink ye all of this." And then when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus then entered into the Garden of Gethsemane and had an amazing experience with his spiritual, internal life in silence, and then went on to be crucified. When I think of Jesus, I think of him as an amazing person in terms of communication. And he not only communicated with his mouth, but he communicated with his body, and he communicated with his being. And he had a tremendous sense of timing. If after this lesson I find out that any one of you went home and grabbed your child and sat them down in a chair and said, "We're now going to communicate because Knox said that's what we ought to do," I don't want anything to do with it. Timing is of the essence when it comes to communication. And I think Jesus really shows this very clearly here. The first thing, before I get into the 4 simple principles that you might carry with you, is that I'd like you to notice who sets up the feast. The one who sets up the Passover feast, the Last Supper, is the Christ. Now, those of you who are new to Unity probably don't know this, but I can say it very quickly. The Christ is that simple internal principle with you who knows that you are one with God and feels empowered and right about the movements of life. And it is this Christ within Jesus that is able to say, we're going to have a feast and we're going to talk about this. Now, I'd like to ask you a very direct question. Are you important enough to set up a feast, to rebuild a relationship through communion? If your answer inside is, yeah, you bet I am, then you're in contact with the Christ. Notice that in this cute little story that it isn't Peter who sets up the feast. Peter probably doesn't feel worthy enough. Neither does Judas feel worthy enough. So it has to be the Christ within you who calls a conference. It has to be the Christ within you who rolls over in bed one night and says to your mate, you know, we're just not making it. What can we do about it? It has to be the Christ in you that goes up to a person who you feel distant from and say, you know, you're important to me. Could we talk? And amazingly, something happens. There's like a letdown. I don't even understand it. There's something that drops inside, an opening enters in. But the most important thing I have to communicate to you all this morning is, you're it. You're the one who's on tap. If you're the one who says, but we don't talk anymore, it's up to you. If you're the one who doesn't feel you're important enough or that you have the power to go into a relationship or go into a business or go into a group of people and say, let's do something about this. Let's stop the underground gossip. Let's stop the bias. Let's stop the distancing, the defensiveness. You're it. I want to tell you something, and I think I should tell you it. I don't think I should hide all of what goes on inside of me from you, but one of the amazing things that's happened with the loss of my father has been that I have noticed people, rather than coming to me, step away. It's as if they think, I've got it all together. And my subtle underlying belief is that they don't think that they're important enough to have impact upon my life, to come up to me and say, you know, I'm sorry. Does that touch any of you? Am I all alone up here saying that? You know, you ought to just really become aware of that thing that we even do to our authority figures. Our mothers, our fathers, our grandparents, our bosses. And what do? We remove ourselves from them. We don't dare come up and put a hand on their shoulder and say, you know, you're important to me. I love you. I'm sorry. Or I care. We separate. And what separates us? You don't know. You're as important in this world, excuse me for your shoulder, but you're as important in this world as I am. And everybody knows that. The Christ sets up the feast. The Christ in you sets up the feast. If the Christ doesn't set it up, it will never happen. You know what will happen? The crucifixion will happen and nobody talked about it. And most lives go like that. One of my happiest feelings is I have no regrets about my father. I told him I loved him. I wrote it on paper. The only thing I'm sorry about is that he doesn't know I was just named a who's who of American women. Now why did you ladies have to leave at that moment? So now let's look at the feast. And the feast in communication is the preparations. If you want to communicate with somebody, if you want to touch them all the way through, you have to touch all the way through into yourself. And then set up the groundwork for the experience to take place. And here's where timing is extremely important. Before I left, I called a feast, and the feast was of my two brothers and my sister-in-law. We needed to commune about what we had just experienced. We'd been all caught up in family, you know, and saying hello to others, but we'd never met. And we had to sit down and talk about how we would care for my mother now. I prepared a feast. And you know what a part of preparing a feast is? It's romance. How many of you say, you know, there's no romance in my life? How many of you say it, huh? How many of you after the first 3 years of marriage say, wonder what happened to the passion? Well, you know, you watch me play a piano here with passion. Do you think I do that idly? Do you think I make love to a piano idly? Do you think that I don't practice it? That I don't put myself into it? That I don't meet it daily? That I don't communicate with it daily? Do you think you can get out of a relationship without making contact and still have romance and passion? Don't you think you have to stroke passion into life? Don't you think you have to stroke communion into life? It's up to you. If you have no romance in your life, that's your problem. You know what I'm going to miss with my father? My flirtations. We were able to flirt without fear of the Oedipus Rex complex. Part of creating the feast of communication and communion is that you have romance, the timing, and that you set up the situation, and that you come to it with your whole being. That includes coming to God, you know. That's why we suggest that you take a half hour a day, because you must prepare the feast. You must go inside. You must talk. That's why in every wedding service that I prepare, I say, do you have a half hour a day for each other? And then what do I suggest that they do? I suggest that they sit with each other and hold each other's hands, and that they talk. And they talk about what's happening inside of themselves without fear. And they talk about their dreams and their hopes, and then I suggest that if possible, occasionally they not talk, and see how difficult it is to stay away from hugging and loving in a half hour of just looking. That'll bring passion back quicker than anything I know. Prepare a feast like Jesus did and commune. And then And the second quality that I see there is that he dared to tell Judas the truth. You know, I put myself out on a carpet all the time. And the way I do it is by daring to say that God is in the essence of every human emotion, including anger, criticism, laying people out in lavender, loving, rejoicing, enthusiastic, whatever you're doing. But notice the example of Jesus. He says, one of you is going to betray me. What he's really saying is, I've got to tell you guys the truth. I can't go to that cross on my own. You've got to know the truth. I know the truth. Won't you come here and join with me in the truth together? You know what that is analogous to? That's analogous to preparing the feast and going there and sitting down and talking about life and what's going on with life. I'm so grateful to my father that one day he prepared a feast in Boston. He called me and said, could we have lunch? We need to talk about your mother. Your mother and you. I'll never forget that feast. And he talked turkey. My nieces said about my father, they said right after the funeral service, they said, you know, Grandpa was able to give criticism, but I always knew he loved me. Why are we so afraid of criticism? Why are we so afraid of laying bombs? Jesus wasn't. One of the most wonderful feasts I ever had with my father was when he called me over at Tufts and he said, Carol, I want to talk to you about men. He'd gotten wind that I'd had 9 dates in 7 days. I'll never forget the feast. And I'll never forget that he told me the truth. We have to tell each other the truth. We have to tell each other occasionally we don't like each other. You don't like me all the time. Just don't tell me on Sundays right after the And you know, sometimes in the telling of the truth, believe it or not, it can be done in silence. I hope you understand that. You don't just have to lay it all out over everybody. A lot of it can be done internally, but there must be a meeting. When I found out that my father had died, the first image that came to me in my mind was the image from Greystoke, the movie. Do you remember? When the fellow found out that his gorilla father had died, he drove around the complex in a horse-ridden carriage, whipping his whip and shouting out in the silent scream, Father, Father. Well, that's communication. It's a silent communication, and that's what I kept hearing inside of me was Father, Father. There was no words outside, there was just deep words inside, and that's communication. Telling the truth. Daring to feel your feelings for what they are, all of the ugliness, all of the holiness, all of the joy. Not caring whether it's good or bad, just caring mostly that it comes out. Tell the truth. And then the third quality, which is the next to the last. Third quality is that you watch the ego fall out of the way. And you know, not many of you know this, but I have been a facilitator for the group process for years. And I'm a counselor and have been for years. And one of the magic things about observing the human process is, if people can dare get out their feelings, then there is always left room for the ego to leave and for sharing to become present. And you've got to have the guts to say, this is what I feel. You have to have the guts to be judged for not being good all the time. You have to have the courage to expose yourself. And why do you do it? Because then you can break open the bottle of wine, take out the bread, and share. Look at the example of Jesus. That's what he does. Here he's just heard Judas say, I'm the one who's going to betray you. Is there anything in the man that punches Judas in the nose? That runs from the scene? No, that's not what happens. And why doesn't it happen? Because Jesus is a good boy? No, because the process is completed and the ego drops out of the way. And when the ego drops out of the way, then you can meet. In every one of my wedding services, I look at people and I say, there's only one thing that will keep you away from each other. your ego. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we all created in our homes the egoless room? If we had a little tray at the door. Now this just came out of me this minute. It really did. And after we've done our spewing and our fighting and our uglifying and our rejoicing and our game playing, done all of that stuff in a real kind of ritual, that we went to this little tray and took our egos wherever they are around us and said, I'm going to put it aside, and then walked into the room. When you walked into the room, there you would sit down and break bread together. That's the secret of our world problems. All that has to happen is for the United States and Russia to get their feelings out, hopefully without guns. Take their egos off, and whatever the hell they're trying to protect is all we want to do is live here on earth together and walk into a room and break bread together. We do know that will take a great movement of human consciousness for it to ever happen. And it's up to us. And that brings me to the climax of communication, interestingly, silence. For when you leave the room after breaking bread together, you go on with your lives. Jesus goes on to be crucified, Peter goes on to deny him, Judas goes on to have to kill himself out of shame and remorse. But all of us, the fascinating, wonderful experience is that we go on in the silence of our life and we're processed with God. That's what's been wonderful about losing my father, is watching me be processed by God. Watching the memories flow through, talking to him. Every morning I wake now. For the first time in 26 years I've said, "Good morning, Daddy." He's more with me now than he's ever been. And there's a joy in these tears. Don't get that confused. But it's what happens in quietness. And we so depreciate it. And I hope you can see there's a balance in what I presented here of mouth, sharing, silence, communion. I'd like to close with a little simple example that Joe's given me permission to share. It happened this morning. Joe's my roommate, the one who opened this morning. She's one of our lay ministers, and we both landed in the kitchen together, you know, with our hair up in curlers, and she was fixing her protein drink, and I was trying to fix my protein drink, and bumping into each other in the kitchen, and I looked at my watch, and it was 8:25, and I said to her, "I told you we'd have to get out of here by 8:45. And she said, "I know, but I can't possibly get out of here by 8:45. My hair isn't even up in curls completely yet." So we banged at each other, you know, ding here and a ding there, here a ding, there a ding, every ding. We do it very well. And then I said, "I feel trapped because I said that I had to come in your car if we were coming, and mine doesn't have any gas in it. And if I was going to get gas, I had to leave in 5 minutes." And so then each of us left the room. I went off to complete my makeup, and she went off to put her hair up in curlers. And about 10 minutes later, we met in my bedroom, and she said, "Well, I'm ready." And I said, "Well, so am I." And you see, what I know happened was that each of us had gone away into our silence. And there we had communed with God, because we both carry the prayer in the heart. And our egos had left the scene of the accident. So driving in the car, I proceeded to take her hair out of curlers. And she said, "I hope nobody sees this. This is going to look very weird."